It is fashionable today, in particular amongst some parts of the left, to talk about this or that policy as a political choice. And yes, it's true that there is a choice. The actions of individuals have a profound effect on events. But there is a deeper level to those choices, namely the interests and the outlook of different classes and factions within those classes. Added to that, there are the conditions in which those choices are made. And once you add all of that up, you realize that there are very few choices in reality. Vladimir Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, is faced with that reality. So is the EU's political establishment. And so is Mr. Donald Trump. My name is Hamid Alizadeh. This is Against the Stream. And I'm here with Nicholas Albin Svensson. We'll be discussing the war in Ukraine, the latest from the war in Ukraine today, as well as the crisis of the European establishment and Donald Trump's big, beautiful bill. So watch this space. Welcome back, Nicholas.
Thank you.
I just wanted to start with something about Ukraine, because on Monday, I thought to myself, I better start watching the BBC News. I normally don't watch it because 90% of it are lies and distortions. There's nothing news in it. There's nothing to get out of it, to be honest. It's just infuriating to watch. But I thought maybe I should start watching it so I know what's going on in the world. This is the first time.
So you know what other people watch.
What other people watch,
yeah.
Exactly. And the main segment was Donald Trump on some airfield giving interviews. And he was raving about Putin. He was saying, I don't know. He says he's gone mad. He says, I've known him for a long time, always gotten along with him, but he's sending rockets into cities and killing people, and I don't like it at all. And he was sending some pretty harsh messages to Putin. And if you look at all of the front pages of every paper, I was visited the Guardian, BBC, Wall Street Journal, the FT, maybe not the FT, but most of them had either as the main piece or one of the main pieces on the front page, Donald Trump calling Putin mad. And then I was on Twitter and someone just highlighted, just happened to see it highlighted, that actually they cut that segment earlier. They didn't show the full segment. Later on, someone had asked Trump if he had heard about Putin's helicopter almost being caught in a drone attack. And the fact is that just prior to this video, this is Donald Trump. Trump was commenting on a massive missile, the barrage of missiles that Russia sent on Kiev and the rest of Ukraine. But that followed as a period of several days, 3 or 4 days, with hundreds and hundreds of drones being launched from Ukraine against Moscow. And reportedly, Putin's helicopter almost got caught in one of these things or something to that like. Now, when Trump was asked about this, he said, "Oh, that might be the reason," right? So he was actually qualifying his position. Now, I'm not here to defend Trump. He stands for his own words, but it's the message, the way that this message is curated for the public, to say that Donald Trump is now against Putin. Putin is mad. He's crazy. He's bombing Kiev and killing children. No mention of what happened on the other side. No mention of what this was a retaliation for. And no mention that Trump himself qualified his statement by saying, "Oh, that might be the reason."
Well, they're obviously feeling vindicated. They feel like it's a vindication of their position that Putin is mad, you cannot deal with him, you cannot negotiate with him, and so on. That's been their position since, well, almost the beginning of the war. So now they say, well, look, Trump tried, didn't work out. And and now Trump has also realized that you can't discuss with Putin.
Yeah.
And I think, well, obviously they feel like this is a vindication of position. And I say the material basis of this, obviously, is the negotiations that have now, I think, more or less broken down between on finding a ceasefire or peace or whatever in Ukraine. And that's then they're basically trying to play the blame game, saying, "Oh, this is all Putin's fault. He's unreasonable. He's making all these unreasonable demands and so on." And that's and it's like, or even Trump realizes that's what they're getting at.
Absolutely. And there's more to this story, though. I would say, well, just to add another media distortion. On the 21st of May, a Ukrainian person, his name is Portnov. I forgot to write down his first name, but he was an advisor, a senior advisor or aide to Yanukovych, who was a president in 2014, who was overthrown. He was a president who was trying to balance Russia and the West. He kind of looked both ways. He was overthrown, and the present regime in Ukraine came to power, which is now the Maidan regime that's now headed by Zelensky. On the 21st of May, in Madrid, he was taking his children to school, the children's drop-off, and he was assassinated in broad daylight. The assassination is the investigation is ongoing, and no suspects have been arrested yet. That's the official line. Everyone knows that this was an assassination by the Ukrainian regime, by the Ukrainian government, and yet nothing. This is not on the front page of the papers. If you remember, a few years ago, we had the assassination of two Russians in Britain by Russia, which was a daily occurrence on the front pages. It was a cause of a major diplomatic row between Britain and Russia. If I'm not remembering, if I'm not mistaken, Britain actually imposed some sanctions on Russia at that point. At least that was on the cards.
I think diplomatic sanctions, maybe some other things as well, but small fry compared to what they're doing now. But
But nevertheless, they made a big deal out of it.
Yeah.
But here you have a situation where this blatant criminal act, someone who's just living his life, is assassinated in broad daylight. Nothing is said about it.
Yeah.
And then you have Trump, half of Trump's statement being portrayed, being put forward. All of these things that we see every day in the media, there is a certain logic to it from the establishment media.
There's also Nord Stream pipeline, which they went very quiet. Well, first they were accusing the Russians of blowing up their own pipeline.
Yeah.
And then they went very quiet on it. The Swedes and the Danes, they closed down the investigation and so on. So, and that was, well, either a work of American intelligence or Ukrainian intelligence. And they never went, they went awfully quiet on it. So this, basically, there's some countries can operate with impunity. Well, Israel is another example. Some countries can operate with impunity. Others are subject to the harshest criticisms.
Yes. And also I would say there is a concerted effort to pin Trump down in this war. It's clear that Trump, for whatever reason, for his own reasons, it's irrelevant what his reasons are. He wants to end this war. He says, it's not my war. It's not beneficial to our interests. We want out of it. And he has clearly been getting closer to Putin. They've had a whole series of phone calls. They've clearly talked in a very collaborative manner about each other. And now there is a big effort on the part of the whole of the establishment to destroy that, to disrupt that. And there is another thing, because you said before that the negotiations between Ukraine and Russia have more or less ground to a halt. Although they say they're going to meet maybe in the Vatican next month, but we'll see where that goes. But within that, there is also another thing, which is the threat of Trump of walking away. He said this on several times. Trump changes his opinion every other minute, but He's said this enough times that you should take it seriously. He says, we're just going to walk away. We're just not going to give you arms anymore. We don't care about Ukraine. We don't. And this is making people panic. In America, in the Senate, there's a bill that's been proposed by Lindsey Graham, who's a Republican, but he's an old-time Republican. He's an establishment Republican, which has 80 co-sponsors, which means that if this gets through the Senate, the president cannot veto it. And obviously, and this is a bill that has huge support from some Republicans, but also obviously from the Democrats. So this is basically an alliance in one way or the other between Graham and the Democrats. The bill is a sanction bill against Russia, which would put 500% tariffs on imported goods from any country that purchases Russian oil, gas, uranium, and other products. This is a declaration of war. This is a nuclear bomb in terms of tariffs.
I don't think of the world.
Of 2/3 of the world, which they're never going to be able to carry it out, because it's going to, if they try this, it's going to just explode in their faces. However, Trump has said that we're in full agreement. We talked about this before, but it does seem to me like there is a wing of the Republican Party, which is a hawkish wing. They say they're Trumpists, but in reality, they swing between Trump and the old establishment, old political establishment. And by this, they're trying to. This is not something you would do in the middle of negotiations, is it? You say we're negotiating in good faith and we want to, and then you pass something like this, which is severely aggravating. Although this bill would only kick in if the negotiations broke down. But nevertheless, it's an attempt again to polarize the situation. We've seen in Germany, Merz has come out. He made several stupid remarks. He says he wants to make it impossible, first of all, for Nord Stream 2 to be reestablished. And then he's been out saying, basically implying, he said, this is on Monday, he said, there are no more range limitations for weapon delivered to Ukraine, neither from Brits, nor from the French, nor from us, not from the Americans either. What does this mean? This means that this is poking the Russians in the eye, saying, we are allowing long-range missiles to strike you. Long-range missiles, all of which have to be operated directly with support from Western troops. The German Taurus missiles, which he's been kind of implying here would maybe be supplied to Ukraine, have to involve both American and German people. The same with the other ones. The Americans have to be involved regardless. So again, this is a way of trying to provoke Russia into a more polarized, more entrenched position against the US in order to what? To stop negotiations. And meanwhile, all they do is saying, Putin doesn't want to negotiate, Putin doesn't want a ceasefire, these guys are the ones who are...
I mean, there used to be a policy for a while, they had a policy that the Ukraine should not be attacking civilian targets, right? They were saying, you can't use the missiles from the West to attack civilian targets. Obviously, the reason being that it would be provocative and also militarily not of great significance. Yeah. But what the Ukrainians are trying to do is to prove that, like, take the war to the Russian home front, so to speak, right? Basically attacking civilian targets in Moscow and so on. Yeah. And that's what has been, they started on a small scale, now it's getting bigger. And now, I think this provoked a rupture in the German government, this announcement of Merz.
He had to withdraw it. He had to backtrack immediately.
Because not everyone is quite as gung-ho as he is. I think it's the Social Democrats who are not, although, they drew the line at the Taurus missiles, and I think that's what they did again, maybe. Yeah. They are part of a coalition. But the opposite part is to try to keep the war going, try to keep it going, even though they're losing, and to try to bleed Russia and obviously at the same time bleed Ukraine, but they don't care about that for as long as it's possible, basically. Because the worst case, what they fear most of all is a peace. Which would be on Russia's terms, because Russia's won the war, or is winning the war, depending on which terms you use. But basically, Russia is advancing, and there's nothing that the West really can do to stop them.
Yes, exactly, and that's what I want to say. They first of all, Merz's statement is an escalation, because the Taurus missiles can carry nuclear warheads, which is what? Which is a massive escalation to send those to Ukraine. It's a sign that we're ready to go further. And also, this is one of the key elements. This is one of the key things that Russia complained about. The idea of a NATO missile shield that was talked about so much in the 90s and the early 2000s was to set up missile bases, long-range missile bases close to Russia, which on paper were for defense, but which could carry nuclear warheads, so they could quickly be switched over. This is a serious military threat. And it's precisely one of the main things that Russia went to war over, because NATO Ukraine would be that. Now, the main thing that they do not want to accept is Ukrainian neutrality. That is, the one demand that Russia has is Ukrainian neutrality. Neutrality to what? Neutrality towards Russia. i.e. that Ukraine cannot be a military threat to Russia. That is the fundamental demand that the Russians have made. And now that they've won, they've taken over all this land, obviously they want to keep that. But the Europeans refuse to accept that. Instead, they're talking about an unconditional ceasefire. They're demanding an unconditional ceasefire, which is what? Which is only to the benefit of Ukraine, because Ukraine is bleeding men, is bleeding resources. They don't have resources. Zelensky has been out saying the Russians are mobilizing 40 to 45,000 men per month. This is Zelensky himself. The Ukrainians are mobilizing 25 to 27,000. It's clear which direction it's going. The Russians are more advanced, have more advanced capabilities. They have a bigger stockpile. Their tactics are now much more refined, costing much fewer men than they did in the earlier stages of the war. They are now advancing rapidly. Spring has come. The foliage is back on the trees, which means you can hide under them from the drones and from other surveillance. They are now rapidly advancing at a much more rapid pace than they have over the winter. The ground is not muddy, it's firm, and they are gaining ground. They are having a very important success around the city of Pokrovsk, which is a key distribution town, and the key of Konstantinivka, which is a major town in the heart of Donetsk. With one operation, they're basically cutting off or severely limiting the supplies to both of those towns. They've started a new offensive in Kharkiv. They've started a limited offensive in Sumy. They're bringing on more people onto the fronts. They're opening up new fronts, whereas the Ukrainians are having trouble plugging the gaps in the old fronts. So it's clear which way things are going. The idea of demanding Russia accede a peace and withdraw is lunacy.
Yeah.
But nevertheless, they do it. And I think the question is, why? That is the question we have to. It's not enough just to say, yeah, they're doing it, and they're vicious and barbaric people who have no regard whatsoever for the lives of anyone. They've destroyed the Ukraine. They're destroying Europe, by the way. All of the gas prices are going up. Inflation is going up. The rising gas prices mean difficulty for industry. Industries are closing down in all of the major economies. All of this is feeding into the cost of living crisis. They're raising military spending, again, raising pressure on the working class. The working class is the people who have to pay for this, not the rich. Not as much anyway, and they're not going to feel it as much as the workers are. But why are they doing it?
I mean, it's a question of Eastern Europe. It's a question about who dominates Eastern Europe. It's a question of the European Union, the unity of the European Union, which is very much under threat. I mean, before the war broke out, this wasn't so much of an issue, which is why the Europeans weren't so heavily invested in it from the start, or weren't so keen about starting the war in the first place. But now it's a big issue. You can see what's happened in Romania, with this election where they almost, what we say, the pro-Europeans almost lost the election to someone who is at least neutral, or at least more friendly towards Russia. Hungary, this has already happened, and a number of other smaller countries. But obviously, the whole Slovakia. But obviously, there's a whole number of countries which, if Russia becomes a stronger power, these countries will be looking towards Russia. Georgia is another example of a slightly different part of the world, but nevertheless. So the risk is that these countries start looking towards Russia for economic cooperation, military alliances, and so on. And that would pose a serious threat to the European Union, which at the moment dominates, and German finance capital in particular, dominates Eastern Europe, industrial and finance capital. It dominates Eastern Europe. And so the threat would be to that position, and where that Russia would basically be in the ascendance, and Europe will lose its markets for investment and goods.
Yeah. There is also the question of US imperialism. Because as we've described many times, all of this is a core part of the decline of American imperialism, essentially. That's what all of these processes could reflect. The Wall Street Journal had an editorial yesterday from the editorial board, which talks about Trump's policy crossroads. And I just think this is quite indicative of the thinking of the top bourgeois in America. They say that this opening paragraph is, the first year of presidencies often sets the tone for the events that follow on foreign policy. Joe Biden's Afghan withdrawal gutted US deterrence and convinced Vladimir Putin and Iran's mullahs they'd meet little resistance if they sought military gains. So what he's saying is, the problem that we have with the problem about Putin being more confident and Iran being more confident is because Joe Biden withdrew from Afghanistan. And one thing they don't explain is America had lost the war in Afghanistan, a war that lasted, how long? 20 years, and cost trillions of dollars, thousands of lives, tens of hundreds of thousands of Afghan lives, thousands of American lives. And in the end, the Americans were isolated to tiny plots of land in the middle of Kabul, more or less, and a few other cities. Whereas the Taliban, supported by leaning also on the hatred against American imperialism, was gaining everywhere, in particular in the countryside. So Joe Biden's withdrawal from Afghanistan was not because it's just his choice. We're talking about, speaking of choices, but because they were defeated. And now what they're saying is that they say that Ukraine is running short of ammunition. Russians could break through, in particular air defenses. They have to choose whether they want to defend the cities or the front line. And what we have to do is basically, we have to double down. We have to double down, because otherwise, what will other people think? If we don't double down and protect our allies, our colony or proxy, that's what it means. Double down and defend our hegemony. That's what it really means, our domination of the world. Then what will other people think? And the same they say with the Iran nuclear deal. They say that Trump talked about maximum pressure on Iran and dismantling the nuclear program. The Iranians have said they're not going to do that, but they want to find a deal. And then they say, now is the time to support an attack by Israel, an attack on the nuclear. But what is that going to help? Apart from dragging America deeper into wars. That's precisely the mistake that they made with Afghanistan, just to jump into a headless war. That was, by the way, at a time where they had full support for the war. They had no budget deficit to speak of. There was a kind of patriotic mood after 9/11. That's not the mood now. A further military adventures would only serve to drag US imperialism further down into this quicksand. And they're saying again that that's also what Trump should do with China. But what's he going to do? We saw in the negotiations, Trump tried to negotiate, tried to play hardball. The Chinese did the same thing. What happened? We're going to talk about that in a minute. Interest rates went up, the markets reacted, and he had to backtrack. You know, it is the ambitions of the ruling class of American imperialism crashing with the hard reality of the limits of US imperialism.
Yeah. Well, there's just the limits of their weapons industry, their willingness of the working class in Europe and the United States to fund this war indefinitely, the willingness of workers in Ukraine to fight the war. And that's what the hard reality that they've come up with. The morale in the Ukrainian army is terrible. And support for the war in the West is plummeting. And that's part of why Trump got elected. He got elected on the program of getting out of the war, stop funding the war.
Yeah.
And at the moment, I think he hasn't cut the funding that was already voted through by Biden. I think that's still going. But if it came to providing more funding, I don't know. How would he do that? It's not, he can't do that but politically, right? I don't think maybe they could tie his hands in some way with some, but I doubt it.
We'll see.
So I think the reality is they were thinking that this was going to be, I think this was their thinking, this was going to be Russia's Afghanistan.
Yes.
And that they would tie Russia down, they would bog them down in war that they couldn't win and so on. But in reality has become the West, another Afghanistan for the West. And that's the reality of the situation.
Yeah. I think there's another aspect, which is Trump, as you said, came to power promising to end the war, promising on an anti-establishment rhetoric. That was the main driving force of the broad anger in society that you just described, of being sick and tired of paying for the adventures and the projects of the ruling class, of the ruling elites. But he is an outsider from the traditional political, establishment. He's an outsider. And that's not just in the US, because the political establishment, this is what we talked about several times as well, the political establishment of US imperialism has got its extension in Europe as well, in the dominant wings of the European ruling classes and their political and media hangers-ons, basically. And this is a struggle. This is also their struggle for survival. Because Trump pulling back is a death blow to that, what we call the liberal world order, the old kind of order of things. He doesn't represent, obviously he represents the same system. He's fundamentally a capitalist. He represents the system of capitalism. But there is a struggle for survival of the old guard, if you can say. And they are also the ones trying to tie Trump in. They are the ones saying, this Wall Street Journal editorial reflects their view of thinking. Never back down, always double down, always go to war, always, if someone defends themselves, hit them harder, basically, until they submit, which has not worked, which is what brought America to where it is, which has actually undermined US imperialism's position. But now those same people are under threat in Europe. You talked about Romania. There is a very interesting article in the FT again from the 25th of May. It's called "Europe's Far Right is Hammering at the Door of Power." Just to say, a defeat in Ukraine would be a defeat for all of these people, for Macron, for Merz, for Starmer, for the entire lot of the EU political kind of ruling elite, if you may, and the European ruling classes. And at the same time, we have these other parties which are coming to the fore, which are which are kind of how do you say, with every setback for the main officialdom, if you may, these guys get stronger. Now, this FT article, they talk about Romania. They say Nicusur, I don't know how you say his name, by the way. Nicusur, I don't know. Nicusur Dan is the winner of the Romanian elections. It says the pro-EU mayor of Bucharest snatched victory from the jaws of ultra-nationalist George Simeon in Romania's presidential election last week. European leaders celebrated. Dan will keep Romania on the democratic, yes, just after they canceled 2 elections, but let's not, they canceled 1 election and arrested the front runner. Dan will keep Romania on the democratic, pro-EU, pro-NATO path it has followed since communism fell. Simeon would have taken it in the opposite direction to a darker place. So it's good for Romania and Europe that he lost. Okay, so they're clearly not hiding which side they stand on. This is the editorial board of the FT, by the way. And then he says something interesting, though. He says, they say that, Simeon still won 46% of the vote. He's down but not out. Unless Dan can somehow usher an ambitious reformist government, Simeon and his AUR party, the second largest in parliament, will draw strength from continued political turmoil, necessary austerity measures, and public disgust with self-serving establishment parties. What they're showing is rising class anger, class hatred for the whole of the establishment, in the absence of a real revolutionary working class alternative, propelling these populist parties to the fore, and undermining the basis, pulling the rug out from under the feet of the establishment, the old guard, the old dominant wings of the ruling class.
I read another article in the FT on a similar line. It was talking about this rise of the reform in UK and other similar parties, and it was saying, well, you cannot solve the problem by basically aping their anti-immigrant rhetoric and so on, which is Starmer is finding out. But you can't solve it that way. What you need to do is to make sure that you deliver, right?
Yes.
So you need to, basically what they need to do is to deliver for people, right? They shouldn't just talk about making life better for people, they should deliver. But that's the fundamental problem, right? None of these people can deliver any improvements for working class people, but rather, as this article says, they have to carry out the necessary austerity, right? And that's what every government is facing. And so this ability to deliver, as they say, which is completely empty words. He doesn't go into this other article. I can't remember who it was that wrote it. This ability to deliver something for working class people, or for the voters, as they call it in the FT, it isn't there. So it's just an empty slogan on their part of wanting governments to basically produce something out of nothing. What are they going to give? There are no reforms on the table. All they got is cuts, austerity, attacks on people's living standards, and that's just from the government budget. And the same is coming from the employers on that side in your workplaces and so on. And so there is this anger is only going to get more and more fed, and basically there's no way forward on the basis of these parties, and that is then also a crisis not just for these particular parties, but also for the whole of, for the political establishment, yes, but also for the European Union, and all of that entails, like AfD, Le Pen, and so on. They are not interested in Europe. They're not necessarily openly hostile to the European Union, but they're not in favor. They're not prepared to sacrifice their own support base in order to defend the European Union, like the other parties are. And so, in faced with this crisis, they're basically them coming to power, and this is why then being deliberately kept out of power in Austria, for example, this Kickel, he was deliberately kept him out of power. Apparently, I think this was from the same article. They kept him out. They said the party was okay, but this particular leader they couldn't deal with, and so the rumor is that the Germans told the Austrian Conservative Party, there's no go. This guy, you cannot work with him. And so they kept him out, right?
Yeah.
Because this is a threat to the whole of the European Union, because we discussed before, the European Union is like necessary for the functioning of European capitalism. And so this would be a threat, be a tremendous economic consequences to this political crisis as well.
Yeah. That's why the Ukraine war, just to go back, that's why it plays such an important role, because this is their project. And the more they have tied themselves to it, the more, desperately they needed to succeed, because a defeat would accelerate this process, which is inevitable, actually. I mean, the downfall of this creature, some people call them the Atlanticists. I don't know if that's a scientific term or not.
Well, it's like NATO, isn't it? It's defender of the
Atlanticists.
US,
Yeah,
EU
it's the
alliance.
combined ruling classes of the US and Western Europe. It reminds me of kind of earlier, in monarchical times, where you had the European monarchical families all being interbred into each other, and they kind of formed one thing, even though they had the different. But here, this organism is much more unified, actually, in their defense of their own interests. But they're being undermined by the crisis of capitalism, and they cannot deliver. And here this is the most reactionary beast organism that's ever existed. That is what this class really represents. It doesn't mean that the people coming to the fore represent a significant change. We're going to deal with that. What determines their basis? Their policies are fundamentally in defense of the same system, but they don't represent the same organism. And I think, that's behind this whole approach of trying to tie Trump down. There's another aspect also. Sorry, I forgot this. There's another aspect, which is a defeat in Ukraine. Trump pull out of Ukraine would also mean American pull out of Europe, or a lowering of their involvement in Europe, the military involvement, the economic involvement, a disentanglement of American and European capitalist interests, which again would leave the rump of the Atlanticists alone in this fractured continent, with a very, very small weight on a world scale, very, very little to lean on, and only, a massive cat fighting, or is that what they call it? Or maybe I just made up a new
cats in
idiom.
a sack.
Yeah. Let's call it cat fighting for now. This is Hamid's new way of saying it. And they need America. They need American imperialism. So in that sense, you see the old establishment in Europe being in an alliance, needing these guys needing the old American establishment. And there's a collective effort to pin Trump down to this war. This is why this war means so much. This is why this war represents such a decisive point in world politics at the moment, because it rests the fate of all of the dominant wings of the dominant wings of the ruling classes of the entire West, which have dominated the world for the past 80 years.
Well, we say that a precondition for a revolution is that the ruling class can no longer rule in the way that they used to. And this is precisely what we're seeing in this present moment in time. The way that they used to rule society through these liberal, if you will call them that, parties, the center-left and the center-right. And that way of ruling, of governing society, is no longer possible. And that's what Trump has shown. Yeah. And that's what's being shown in country after country.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean that, they're all going to automatically go away and so on. But that way of that kind of that political establishment which existed and had its way of operating, it doesn't function anymore.
Exactly. And as communists, the main point for us is to see through this thick wall of lies and distortions of precisely that this creature, let's say the Atlanticist wing or the dominant wings of the Western ruling class, they're still the main enemy of the working class. And we must understand this whole process of these rising populist parties. What do they represent? They don't represent a move to the right what they represent is a burning anger against the establishment, which has not been reflected through through a working class alternative. Because of we've discussed this in many previous episodes, because of the betrayals of the left, there's a huge vacuum there, and you have these demagogues essentially going up and using that vacuum for their own purposes. But the fundamental problems of the class struggle are not going to go away. Our task as communists is to understand and to be able to, link up with that mood, to see through how the working class sees this. One thing is Nigel Farage at the top, who's a reactionary and a demagogue, and he's just basically, he's fooling the workers with his demagoguery. And one thing is the working class who's looking for something, a radical response and a radical way to fight back against the attacks of the main part of the ruling class. And if we see that, then we can approach that. We can separate the progressive from the reactionary in the outlooks of the workers. And in the next period where all of these parties, one by one, will come to power, just like Trump, and will be put to the test, and they will fail miserably because of, well, we're going to discuss that in a minute, because of the contradictions within the system itself, because the system cannot offer any solution, and because they represent the same fundamental class interests as the old people. Well, then that layer of the workers are going to look for another alternative.
Well, I mean, arguably, what these guys are trying to do is try to find a kind of cross-class basis, and to try to, on the basis of exporting unemployment, exporting social problems, protectionism, is to find the kind of a social stability. But it's evident from the first 100 days of the Trump presidency that nothing like that is forthcoming. In fact, all of his policies that he's trying to implement are actually just intensifying the crisis. And that's not going to stop these parties from coming to power, because it's not a question of the ruling class being able to pick and choose which party they put in power. They won't have a choice. At one point or another, Le Pen will come to power in France, or her party. And they cannot stop them. AfD will have a success in Germany as well, because the center does not have anything to offer, right? So these parties, and there is no alternative on the left as well, as you said. So these will come to power, and the ruling class will have to accommodate themselves to it. And they will, like capitalism will not abolish, these parties will not abolish capitalism. In fact, they will continue it. Yeah. But it will massively intensify the economic crisis and the political crisis. That's going to be the consequences of them coming to power. Potential breaking up of the European Union. The recession on the cards in the United States. All of these are the consequences, the economic consequences of the political crisis that has been created in turn by the economic crisis.
Yes. Well, let's move on to the economic crisis then, because we have the big beautiful bill.
Yeah.
Tell us about the big beautiful bill, Nicholas.
Well, Trump, he made a number of promises, and we should. A lot of this big beautiful bill is actually stuff that goes back to.
This is the new U.S. budget, correct?
Well, it is the putting into legal code some of what they already voted on a couple of months ago, right? Mm-hmm. So they voted on the outlines of a budget a couple of months ago. I mean, it's the parliamentary, but this is actually putting the legal. They gave themselves the framework, and now they're giving the legal details of exactly how their spending is going to fall. And a lot of this goes back to Trump's tax bill in 20. Yeah, it would be 8 years ago, right? Mm-hmm. So 2017.
Yeah.
Right, when he introduced a big bill of tax cuts, which was to stimulate the economy. And now basically some of these were made permanent, like the corporation tax cut, which brought it down to 23% from 32%, I think. It's a big cut in corporation tax. And a lot of the others were set to expire, I think next year. So they needed to renew them. And that's what this big, beautiful bill is doing. Well, the most of what it entails is precisely extending these tax cuts and adding a few more. So extending them for another 5 or so years and then adding a few more to boot. And this is extremely costly. So I think we're talking about over this period is $4 or $5 trillion that it's going to cost to extend these tax cuts. And unlike in 2017, this was at that time because it was a stimulus to the economy, because tax cuts hadn't, like you're adding more money into the circulation in the economy, giving particularly wealth, like upper middle class Americans, you say, the people higher income, not necessarily wealth, the capitalists, but also the higher income workers, wage earners with a higher income, giving them more money to spend and so on. And this was a way of stimulating the economy, also creating more money for investments and so on. But now this is like the status quo, right? So it's actually not going to have a stimulating effect on the economy at all. It's just not going to have that effect of withdrawing money, from the circulation. But it's the same tax cuts basically. For higher earners are getting a lot of tax cuts.
This is individuals and couples who earn more than $100,000 a year.
Well, it's lots of different measures, but yeah, they're the best. Like I'd say there were some figures here that the ones who are going to benefit the most are, the top 10% of the income bracket who will get a 3.3% increase in their income after, I presume, compared to what would have happened if this tax cut would have expired. Then there are some tax cuts also for people who are earning tips and things like that, but there's a smaller items and the bigger.
So people isn't that something? So tips and overtime pay is not taxable. Is that what this is?
There's something like that. You're going to be able to deduct it. There's also some increase in child credit, but all this is costing money. Then they're trying to get some of it back by carrying out some cuts. And so there is about $1 trillion worth of cuts that are also as part of this bill to Medicaid and Medicare in particular. There was also all this stuff from US, like some of the cuts they were already carried out, they're now codifying. But the big items are Medicaid and Medicare, which is going to deprive something of 10 million people of Medicaid coverage, is estimated by the Congress Budget Office. There's some food stamps they're going to cut as well, or eligibility for food stamps. There's going to 5 million people are going to lose access to food stamps. So it's big attacks on the poorest in society. A number of uninsured people in the healthcare system also is going to increase by 1 million or so. So it's a big attack in here also against the poorest people. But still, the gap between the cuts and the cuts to spending and the cuts to income, tax cuts, there's a massive gap still, which leaves something like over $400 billion a year that adds to the deficit in the US federal budget. And this is why now, one of the reasons now the markets are getting very jittery, and they're worried basically about the long-term viability of US federal finances. And they already, like, I think interest rate payments for the US now is something like 18%. So out of the federal budget, almost 1/5 is going to paying off interest on the debt they've already accumulated, which is
more than the military, more than anything else.
Yeah, there might be 1 or 2 posts that are bigger, but I mean, it's like Social Security, I think, as a big block is bigger, but I mean, yeah, that includes many different things. But it's a 1/5 of a budget, and they're calculating that at the end of this 10-year period, it might have reached as much as 30%. All things remaining equal, but obviously we're not, like a recession and so on, which I'll throw those calculations out the window as well. So this is a massive increase in the indebtedness of the US state, and it's mirrored in many other countries which have precisely the same dynamics developing. They can't cut the budget because they will plunge the country into recession. So they can't cut the deficit, but then they cannot sustain the deficit either because they're so heavily indebted. All like Now, most of the big countries having debts of over 100, government debts of over 100% of GDP, and with rising interest rates, which are not coming down quickly enough, it's all creating a massive crisis of public sector finance.
Yes, I mean, you said it right. The bulk of there's going to be a huge cost piled up on the American working class, which a large section of which voted for Trump, and the poor, while the middle earners and the top earners are going to see some benefits. Although they do say that this question of tax relief for what's it called, tips and overtime payment, that is something. They have also said that they will crack down on overcharging of pharmaceutical companies. So it's clear that as opposed to previous Republicans, Trump is quite different this time around, in particular, in trying to appease the working class, in trying to appear as giving concessions to the working class. On balance, that's probably not what's going to happen. Is going to take more than he's taking. And the main point, how do you say, impulse to this is not so much an ideological choice, because I think if he could spend, he would love to just spend.
I think Trump was against the cuts in Medicaid and Medicare, and there's some Republicans who are very worried about it because it affects some of Republican states, some of the poorer Republican states.
There you go.
Like I think Louisiana, West Virginia are two of the countries that are being worst affected.
Trump is a populist. He would probably love to give some concessions, print some money, like he did in when the pandemic came. He printed a ton of money, $5 trillion, and just handed it out. Of course, that money went to pay bills that would actually end up in the pockets of American big business. So they were the ones who benefited in the end.
Yeah, but he gave was it 12? I can't remember if it was $1,000 or $1,200 to every U.S. taxpayer or something like that.
Yeah, so that's not beneath him to do that, let's say. But there is a limit to what he can do, precisely because of the enormous debt that America sits on, that is increasing rapidly. And as you say, the payment of the interest rates alone take up 18% of the budget. That's a huge figure, and it's only going to increase because what we have now is rising interest rates, and a lot of these loans have to be renewed in the next few years. You were talking about how many was it in the next few months?
I can't
hundreds
remember,
of
but
hundreds.
because they are the average maturities, they say, when the government borrows, they borrow something called a bond, which means like it's an IOU. It's like I give you the money back plus interest in like 5 years, 10 years, 30 years. And the average maturity of government bonds is something like 7 years, typically, like for many countries. So if you think about the pandemic, 2020, 2021, that period, so a lot of government bonds were issued in that period to try to cover up for these massive
where the interest rates
stimulus
were zero.
packages. That's right. And then now these are all starting to come due.
Yeah.
So, and this is going to be basically a bit of a wall of refinancing requirements from governments. And in the during the pandemic, they had also the backing of the central banks who were printing money in order to cheapen the cost of borrowing. Now the central banks have been trying to pull that back because of the inflation effects that they had.
Yes.
Like far from, I mean, there are some people, some modern monetary theory, they have the idea that you can just print money and then you can destroy it whenever, inflation comes along. But this is not as simple as that, because precisely what they did during the pandemic, they printed the money. They went to the government to fund all these pandemic stimulus, like the $1,000 for American, the unemployment benefits that they were giving a lavish unemployment benefits during the pandemic, and all of that money, right, was created and fed into inflation, and then the central bank is trying to pull it back, but by they call it tapering. right? So
Yeah.
easing and then tapering. So they're trying to pull the money back, which means that they're selling government bonds with rates, which makes this at the same time as the US government is trying to sell US government bonds. So basically the market is saturated and there's not enough.
Supply is higher than demand, in other words, in government bonds, in government credit.
Yeah, and the investors are just worrying, look, I mean, they're still having on shorter dated debts, they still have a little bit, but they're like looking at 10 year, 20 years or 30 years. Some government bonds are really long ones. And they're looking, well, I'll give you for the 5 years, but I don't believe in 10 years. Yeah. I'll lend you money for 5 years. But obviously for the government, that's a problem, because if they typically were borrowing money for 10 years or 20 years even, that's sitting quite pretty. But if it's just 5 years, then they're constantly at the whims of the market, right? They're constantly needing to worry about how they're going to find enough money to keep going, because they have to refinance all the old debt, right? Not just the new debt, but also all the old debt.
Yeah.
It's not like a mortgage which you pay back of like 25 years or something, a little, right?
Yeah.
But you have to pay back the whole sum every time it comes due.
And if you don't have that, which is what they don't, they have to just take up a new loan to pay it. It's like you take up a new credit card to pay back the old one. But in the meantime, you've taken up 2 other credit cards, and you're so burdened by debt, and your income is declining, that the bank is saying, well, we're not going to give you a new credit card to replace the old one unless you pay us higher interest rates. So you take up the new credit card with a higher interest rate.
Yeah.
And then you kind of snowed under, and the snowball rolls. And the more this continues, this is what Moody calls it, a negative feedback loop between higher deficits, higher debt, and higher financing costs.
Yeah. So Moody was the last credit agency to downgrade US debt.
Yeah.
So the others have already said, well, we don't think that the US is AAA rated anymore.
Yeah.
They have, I think it's AA1 or something like that, they called it.
AAA is the highest rating by a credit rating agency, which determines your credit worthiness.
Yeah. And now there'll be not all the credit agencies have notched them down a bit, right?
Yeah.
From the highest.
I mean,
Moody's was the last one to do it.
Who would trust to get their money back from the US in 10 years? Or ever?
Yeah. I think they're still getting some, because obviously, if you look at the alternative, who else are you going to lend money to? I mean, that's another factor in the situation, right? Obviously, other governments are facing similar. So you're going to lend it to like the British government? Well, I don't think so. That they're probably even less creditworthy, although I'm not sure about their rating, but in reality, they're probably less worthy of giving money to than the American, or the Spanish government or the French government. I mean, which is going to be where you're going to put your money? You're going to put it in the stock exchange again. That's not very safe investment. So
this is the bourgeoisie waking up from a massive hangover they had in the early 2000s, in 2008. And in 2020, they were faced with a major economic crisis. Capitalism, by default, it has its own internal laws which cannot be controlled by anyone. And it goes into crisis on a regular basis. But the past 30 years, the capitalists have overcome each one of these crises by printing money and just spending like there's no tomorrow. And when you read it, I mean, even now you read the FT, and people say, no, don't worry, the central banks will always sort it out. They just print some new money. They lived in this bubble, this kind of bonanza party. You know, you can imagine the craziest party that you can have on Wall Street, and just have that on a global scale, and not thinking about tomorrow. And now is tomorrow, because interest rates are now going up. The economy is grinding to a halt, which means that income is lower. Then you have interest rates going up because people are a bit more jittery about, lending money to these states. Interest rates in the West are now, I mean, in the developing world is an entirely. We should do a whole segment about that in the future. But in the West, interest rates are now higher than the GDP growth of some countries. So in Britain, for example, interest rates went from about 0% before 2020 to about 3 or 4% now. That's a massive.
I mean, it's a bit higher than that.
On 10-year bonds.
Okay, you mean the governments?
Yes, the government bonds. Yeah, But meanwhile, the GDP is growing by almost nothing, right?
Yeah.
So that means that the debt to GDP is, and there's no contingency, there's no plans of solving this. For example, the Labour government came out with a 14 billion pound, the FT calls it a plan, economic plan. In reality, it was cuts, right? And they thought they had built in this a 10 billion pound buffer that they could use for whatever, military or paying off the debt. Then they were shocked to find out in December and January, I believe, that the refinancing had cost them 10 billion pounds. And they had to cut that from other expenses. That's why we have the PIP cuts and other cuts that have been announced. In France, they couldn't pass a budget because they needed to introduce 60 billion euros worth of cuts. Bayrou has now come and said that France is heading towards a crisis if they don't have any spending cuts. Interest payments now in OECD countries, which this is the average, but in some countries it's higher, is 3.3% of GDP, which is higher than what they spend on the military. Right?
Yeah.
And now and on top of that, they're now talking about raising military expenditure to 5%.
Yeah, Trump is announcing another 150 billion to the Pentagon to create for new arms.
There you have it. And on top of this is interesting because this is the FT. The FT has an article called "Policymakers Fret Over Rising Sovereign Debt." This is from about 4 weeks ago, and they say, oh, there's one other thing, which is that markets are now beginning to act. Because what happened was, when Trump announces tariffs on China, the markets went into panic because they could see the impact that this would have on the global economy. And also because they could no longer predict what's going to happen in the US. You know, the idea that you can't plan, you build a plant, let's say you build a plant now, you build your plants, you bring them from Mexico to the US, if you even can be bothered to do that, because that might not be viable. Then what about when Trump leaves? Will someone else come and replace that, right? That policy. And then it makes more sense to go back to Mexico. So the instability, the lack of foresight means that it puts a damper on the economy, which means that people feel less secure. And then you have the piling up of the debt, no end in sight, no plan in sight. And the markets get jittery. What happened then was that Trump had to withdraw. He had to backtrack and he had to make a deal with China. And now they're in negotiations to kind of finalize or whatever, right? Then you had the Bank of England again, which was forced by attacks by the market to taper, i.e. to sell some of these bonds, to not hold all of these bonds, to pull out of the markets because it's unsustainable. All of this debt is unsustainable. But this is the dilemma they have now. Before, they could do whatever they wanted to. There was no pressure. The consequences were in the future, right? But now the consequences are today. If they don't act in a responsible manner, i.e. according to the laws of capitalism, and unload all of this infectious pus that they've accumulated in terms of credit, then the markets are responding. This is just the early beginnings. This is small reactions, but you can see big reactions in the future.
Well, I mean, you have the fact is that governments, the whole economy is completely addicted to debt.
Yeah.
I mean, if it's private consumer debt, or in particular, I would say since 2008, this government debt has become an increasing bigger part. And the government deficit is what keeps the economy afloat, right? The US had this they had a substantial growth in the last couple of years of like 3% or so. But the budget deficit is equivalent to 5 or 6% of GDP. So it's not very difficult maths to work out. If you cut the budget deficit to zero, right, that will bring the economy into recession.
Yeah,
that's the truth of the matter. So the whole economy is dependent on this constant stimulus from the government, effectively borrowing money and handing it out, right? But this is becoming unsustainable. At the same time, then, as you then have this intensification of the trade war, so you're creating basically a perfect storm. I mean, and this printing of money just isn't you can do it, but we have seen the consequences of it. And they haven't been able to resolve the question of inflation. They're trying, but they haven't been able to resolve the question of inflation. Maybe in the EU, it's a little, they've managed to put down. So France now, probably because of economic activity is declining, but nonetheless, the inflation is down there. But in Britain and United States, the inflation is, in Britain, it just went up. And in the US, it remains at the elevated level. And the tariffs, which they're bringing in, risks bringing this up even further. So where are they going to go? Like they didn't have any. They're now basically sitting. They had the tools, the various kind of tools, some wise, some less wise, to try to get out of the crisis, and they've used them all up.
Yeah.
So they've now created for themselves a perfect storm.
Yeah.
Where they're going to find, have the trade wars, they're going to have a government debt crisis, government debt crisis, all happening at the same time. And we don't exactly know when all this, and then they have corporate debt as well. There's a big problem with corporate debt because they can't afford the interest rate payments either. A lot of companies are risking bankruptcy over that question because they also have to pay elevated interest rates. They're also facing the same problems. So they risk basically facing a perfect storm. And we don't have a crystal ball. We can't tell what would happen, when exactly this will play out and exactly how. But you're now seeing that all the chickens are coming home to roost in the political sphere and in the economic sphere.
Yeah, and the main question, which is the whole point from our point of view, is the question is going to be posed, who pays? And that's already what we're seeing in this big, beautiful bill. That is actually the official title of this bill. The big, beautiful bill is who's going to pay for all this, right? And here we see a tax against the poorest. In Britain, we saw a tax against the poorest, a tax against disability benefits and other how do you say, poor areas of
the winter fuel payments, pensioners and so on.
In France, you saw the 60 billion euro cuts had to be mainly aimed at the working class, social benefits, social security, these kind of things. Because obviously the capitalists don't want to pay. But after years and years and years of tightening their belts, accepting what's told to them, accepting so-called economic orthodoxy, listening to the news, there is a sense that this is enough, right? And we're tired of people are beginning to say, stop. This is again linked with the Ukraine war. Why are we fighting this? Why are we paying for this war? Why are we paying for your war? And there is a backlash, and all of this is and will lead to massive class struggle. We've talked about it before. This in Western Europe, this is an end to life as we know it. That's the beginning of end of life. It hasn't really filtered through yet, but the cuts that are waiting, not just from the budget deficits, but from the general economic crisis which is brewing, the decline in trade, the frictions within the EU, the rising military budgets, that is going to mean a huge. That's also what all of these parties are trying not to do. All these ruling classes are trying not to do because they know what it's going to mean. When the FT writes, all that the establishment parties have to do is to deliver.
Yeah.
Well, this is what they can deliver: austerity, a tax, and they're gonna reap. What is it? They're gonna sow the wind and reap a world. Was it so? Anyway,
reap what they sow.
They're gonna reap a whirlwind, right? They're gonna reap an almighty backlash of rage and fury by the working classes. And yes, at the moment, that anger is being reflected through these parties. But at the end of it, these parties represent the same interests as the old parties. And once they have been discredited,
because they have no solutions either.
They have no solution. What's the solution? More tariffs, more nationalism. Well, no, that's not any solution whatsoever. There's no solution on a capitalist basis. Everywhere you turn, it's like being stuck in quicksand. The best thing to do is not to move at all. But in either direction you try to move, you sink deeper. And that is basically what the dilemma that's posed for the bourgeois. And for us, it means we have to prepare for huge class struggles in the next period, where the choice will be put to the workers who shall rule this society, or to humanity rather. Should be the workers and the poor, those who produce the wealth, who make society run, or is it the capitalists, the bosses, the bankers, those who sit at the top and leech off the labor of the many?
Yeah, the ones who've gotten us into this mess, and the ones who have the way of getting us out.
Exactly. I think that's a perfect place to end. What
Yeah.
do you think? Yeah. No last comments.
No, don't.
Okay.
I'll leave it there.
Well, this was Against the Stream. I have one last announcement to our listeners and viewers out there, which is that we have had a series. We have quite strong indications that Against the Stream has been targeted, in particular on YouTube, by the YouTube algorithm, which means that our reach has been severely curtailed. So we are asking a special appeal to our listeners out there to make sure to like and subscribe all of the videos, to watch them from beginning to end, preferably, and also to comment substantially in the comment section. So writing, this is a great show, that's not necessarily what adds something, but if you write a comment, a point of view, open a discussion in the comment section, this will really help us bring the show out to more people, and distribute our ideas even more. And it would also make for some really good conversations and discussions in the comment section. So please do that. Send the show to your friends, families, and we'll be back again next Thursday, 6 p.m. UK time. Thank you very much.